Welcome to episode 6 of the video lessons. Today we're looking at the liberal reforms, and this is going to be an absolutely huge one because in reality there are 4 separate questions they could ask. I mean, they could ask a general one about the liberal reforms, but there's nothing to stop them asking them an entire 20 and 10 mark question at the AS and the 20 mark question at the A2 about just one of the 4 reforms. The 4 reforms being pensions, working conditions, education, and the national insurance stuff. So you need to make sure you can explain each of these in depth. The reason we put them together, though, is the argument is essentially the same. The specifics are slightly different. And therefore, so once you get why the reforms look the way they are, life is pretty easy. Once again, the standard warning, this is not enough specific information. This is not, these lessons are not to give you all the facts you need. This is only for the analysis, which helps you make the jump from the B to the A star. You will need to go and make sure you research the specific own knowledge in your own time. So, we need to understand why the liberal reforms look the way they do. Why are they dated when they are? Why are they the nature of why they are? Essentially, most questions will rely on you to explain why the liberal reforms are so pushing certain things more than others, why some things are more important, why some things are less important, why there is the specifics of pensions, working rights, etc. miss certain things and include others. To understand that, you need to understand the logic of the Liberal Party. Okay, so between 1906 and 1908, Campbell Bannerman was Prime Minister. This is why we don't see very much reform, apart from David Lloyd George and the Board of Trade, and that's because he's a force of nature, ignoring pretty much what the Prime Minister says. We see very little reform here. Campbell Bannerman is an old-school Liberal. He is Gladstonian to the nth degree. He is an old man. He has not got the zeal or the desire or the energy for massive reform. So therefore, up until 1908, when Campbell Bannerman is replaced by Asquith, we see very little change. Now, from 1908 onwards, Asquith, who is more of a new Liberal, now he is, in reality, it's a sliding scale. Campbell Bannerman is definitely more Gladstonian, but David Lloyd George and Churchill are definitely more New Liberal than Asquith. And Asquith, in reality, particularly as he gets older, will go back to Gladstonianism, mostly actually because it's not what David Lloyd George does, and that's how you brand yourself if you don't like David Lloyd George. It's the anti-David Lloyd George idea, and that's Gladstonian liberalism. But from 1908 onwards, we still have essentially someone who is more New Liberal, Asquith, in the Prime Minister office, and more than that, David Lloyd George, who is a force of nature, who is someone who will crack on and get stuff done, and strongly New Liberal. Always remember, David Lloyd George believes in nothing politically, but what will help him secure power and secure his own prestige. So therefore he will push that New Liberal agenda, but when time comes in 1918 to shift that, he will happily shift that. So the Liberals, to some extent, have to make some reforms. Partly because ideologically that's what they believe in, but obviously ideology is the first thing to go once you've been elected as Prime Minister. So the forces making them having to do reform is they were elected on the mandate, i.e. people voted for them, based on the promise to reform. This means that if they fail to deliver that reform, they might alienate a lot of people, particularly those people on the left of the party. And if you remember, the whole point of doing new liberalism was to make sure that the left wing of the Liberal Party don't defect to the new Labour Party and therefore split the vote and basically force the Liberals to lose both the right wing of the party to the Conservatives and the left wing of the party to the Labour Party. So essentially they have to do a degree of reform, because that's their raison d'etre. And if they fail to, that will only mean that more people will vote for Labour next time. However, they have always been a little bit vague about what sort of reform, and the reason for this is obvious. If you promise loads and loads of specific reform, A, you have to make it happen, but B, that will alienate your right wing. Okay, if you say reform but don't say what, it's easier for everyone to sort of see what they want to see in it. The right wing will assume it's not going to be too much, the left wing will assume it's going to be quite a lot. It gives you room for manoeuvre. So in reality, while they have to make some reforms, precisely what those reforms are is very hazy and not very specific at all. Okay, so new liberalism is therefore going to push some sort of reform, but they are not bound into what sort of thing. But if you remember, new liberalism isn't collectivism, it isn't socialism. It's the idea that there should be a small contribution to the state to help individuals who are trapped by poverty escape poverty through self-help. Okay, so it's a fusion of individualism, i.e. the person, some people deserve it, some people don't. The person ultimately has to help themselves out of poverty, but a bit of collectivism in that the state has to also help the individuals get themselves into an economic, social, educational position so they can do that. Okay, so the Liberal Party therefore is going to make some sort of reform, not too radical because it will alienate the right wing, but all still meaningful so that they can show they've made reform to keep the left wing happy. It is going to fuse a combination of individualism, i.e. still assuming there is good poor and bad poor, deserving poor and undeserving poor, still assuming that people should be allowed to sort of encourage their own, be encouraged to work hard themselves rather than getting them dependent on the state. And there is still going to be a sense of the government will increase its role. Okay, so if you take all this together already, you can pretty much tell how the reforms are going to go. And when you explain the extent and limitations of the reform, usually the reason it hasn't got any further or hasn't gone any hasn't been more conservative is because they are trying to balance these pressures. Okay, so essentially, considering that the Liberal Party has this huge majority post 1906, what we see is they have a lot of opportunity and leeway for reform. What that means is they don't have to worry too much when making the reforms about keeping too many MPs happy. That is a godsend. It is very easy, or it's easier, sorry, to make a centrist sort of policy which balances everyone perfectly. What makes that much harder is if you also have like a majority of 10 MPs, someone's always going to be annoyed and destroy your law. Because you've got so many MPs, you don't, once you've decided what you're going to do, you kind of know it's going to pass through Parliament, and that's one fewer thing to worry about. So, what we are going to do is we're going to look at the background of each of the areas, what was there before, look at what the reforms did, although we're not going to look into much specific information because you're expected to revise that yourself, and then we're going to explain why does it look the way it does, why is it limited, what is the sort of evaluation of it from the historical perspective. But always bear in mind as we're going through this that the Liberals are boxed into what they have to do. They have to make some reform, but at the same time it can't be too much. It has to emphasise individualism, but it also has to increase the role of the state. It also needs to make sure that the Labour Party keeps happy. So things which the Labour Party are more concerned about, working rights for example, will get more attention than stuff they're less concerned about, like education. Okay, so poverty in terms of elderly and unemployed. Now, we mentioned this at the very first, or second lesson even, where we talked about the poor law. The old and the unemployed were given a series of local level relief. Now, in reality, because every region and every area were run separately, you would see, although there was a common theme, there were workhouses, it was quite poor, there wasn't really much effort, and it focused on deserving and undeserving poor. Ultimately, there was no systematic, well-funded system, which means there was a lot of variation. You could be in one place, like Poplar in East London, which is relatively left-wing, and therefore you've got quite a lot of support, whereas more conservative rural areas will give you less support. Okay, so the poor law generally focus a lot more on the workhouses, as we mentioned before. They were cost effective because people in the houses would have to work, and therefore they would pay off kind of the costs of keeping them alive. And also they're seen as punitive. If you give someone a handout, some of the poor law custodians, the poor law guardians, the people in charge of poor law, would think, well, if we gave people handouts, it will only encourage more poor people not to help themselves. Whereas workhouses are seen as suitably punishing, that people will not take them up on the poor law unless they absolutely have to. And remember that the idea was that poor, particularly the elderly and the poor, unemployed, they should have saved up for a rainy day. Instead of saving up their money, what they decided to do was spend it all, and meant when they're old, they then expect the taxpayer to pay for their luxuries. And actually, had they drunk less alcohol, had they not spent their money as poorly, had they saved, had they been modest in their spending habits, then they would have a perfect amounts of money to survive in old age or unemployment. Okay, and therefore, if you gave too much welfare to them, what will happen is it will just encourage more and more people, rather than save for their future, it will just encourage them to spend money because they're like, oh, I'm going to get lots of handouts by the state later, so what's the point? This actually does not really change, although there is a little bit more leeway. Now, in the 1870s, we see a rise in workhouses being used. 1895, there's a suggestion of pensions copying the Bismarckian reforms in Germany, but they say no, if we have pensions, people will then start spending money flippantly and not save for their own old age, and therefore they will lead to dependence on the state. Okay, and in 1898 we see a pressure group backed significantly by the unions pushing for the idea of old age pensions, but it doesn't have too much effect. Unemployed, again, same sort of thing. There's less agitation about unemployed simply because old age people are fit more neatly into the deserving poor. It's quite difficult to look at an old person and think they could work their way out of this. Whereas the unemployed, there's always the idea that they could find another job, or they're unemployed because they haven't looked hard enough, or something like that. So that's the unemployed and elderly, the idea of poor law, punitive, limited state, because they don't want to encourage people to be lazy. And it's a very similar story to some extent with working conditions. However, education is a little bit different. Now, number one, it's very important when judging this question, if it comes up, to point out that people's idea of the value of education was very different to the value of education today. Education, was not the vehicle to social mobility that it necessarily is today. There is no formal qualifications. There's a lot of apprenticeships, for example. So if you want to become, I don't know, a significant member of government, you will kind of already get that job if you're rich enough. If you're rich enough, you go to a public school, you get educated sort of in the classics, but ultimately, because of who you are, you will naturally get a really rich job. And you will naturally run the civil service, you'll be a minister, whatever. You'll be a senior member of the clergy or the army. If you are middle class, you'll then, similar things, you might go to a grammar school. But again, the education you get and the qualifications you get beyond reading and writing are more about giving you the sense of class and sort of sense of propriety and properness. That means you can mix without making a scene in sort of richer circles. So what we see is these people then go on to become lawyers or doctors, not so much through getting qualifications, but then passing entrance exams to university or becoming apprenticed to someone their dad knows. And a lot of that relies on contacts and money. So the idea that you can put poor people into a school and then they'll suddenly become middle class is very difficult, because actually there's no qualifications they can get, and it relies much more on connections and class, and you can't really teach that. And if you try and make everyone class, have upper class, middle classness, then all what happens is the middle classes, to show that they're different to working classes, will invent new things, etc. And as well as that, this education in this period is seen as pointless to some extent, because there's this idea of natural ability, even more than today. The idea that some people, ideally the people, the poor, if you base it on Darwinian social theory, are incapable. They're naturally incapable of being too intellectual. So it's a waste of time to try and educate them to some extent. Okay? Ability is linked to class and morality. So what we see, therefore, is even amongst the left wing, with the exception of some pushing massive socialists, because most people's children will work in the mines, in the factories, the socialists tend to focus less on trying to make education better and more on trying to make workplace better. They don't see education as that important, because what people will do is they all leave it at 12 and they'll go into the coalface. And therefore you should try to focus on getting the quality of life and the pay and the conditions of the coal mining industry, of the factory industry, improving that, not education. So there's less emphasis on education across the whole political spectrum. The right see it as, well, you can't possibly educate the poor, they're feckless, etc., etc. And the left don't see education as valuable or as effective in actually changing the lives of the poor. So in reality, the existing system by 1906, is universal elementary school, primary school education, which only really focuses on reading and writing, some basic numeracy, and then some potted history, etc., etc. So it is not particularly education, and it's particularly not education which is designed to genuinely lead to more intelligent and, more importantly, more socially mobile children. Okay. Now, obviously, if you're rich or you're middle class, you will pay for prep schools, and therefore you will naturally go to schools which provide more of that educational backing. Then you'll go to the private fee-paying secondary schools and go up from there. But the mandatory bits, if you want to go to a state school, they're not really trying to educate you to make you brighter. They are trying to teach you the basics. They are trying to give you a basic sense of being British, but that's about it. Okay. So what we see, therefore, is very poor quality education, because there's education, and educating the poor is seen as a bit of a waste of time and not massively important. Therefore, not very much money, not very many resources, not good levels of pay for teachers, etc., etc., etc. We do see a lot of small-scale private religious schools, private independent schools and public schools, which vary with quality. So at the very top end you have Harrow and Eton, which provide an excellent classical education from boys aged very young all the way up until university entrance, which is actually a bit younger in this age. But that only if you can afford it, and obviously most people cannot. So what we see, therefore, is across, as you got the class barriers, people are paying more and more for the education, and the education is more and more helpful. But always remember that qualifications don't exist. In fact, the GCSE as we currently know it is only from the 1980s, for example. So what we see running up to 1906 is the only areas where there's a real push for making education better is not about making education better so people are brighter so that they can become middle class. It's not training people in technical skills. The industry needs more boiler makers, needs more mechanics, needs more welders, and therefore the education system, there's an increase in the technical colleges and the technical secondary education, where in a couple of places working class boys can learn a trade. And therefore technically go from working class to upper working class. But again, that's limited and not seems very important. Okay. Aside from that, there is no secondary school education. In fact, as a result of the court ruling, it is illegal for local authorities, councils, to actually use tax money they have gained to pay for secondary schools. To pay for secondary schools, people have to pay themselves, which actually means working classes will not massively go there. Okay, and again, as the controversy over the education reforms on the Balfour show, that there is suspicion amongst, particularly the religious nonconformists, that if the government is allowed to interfere with education, if the government is allowed to give government money to pay for schools, what's going to happen is the government will prioritise Anglican schools, and that means non-conformist schools will not get as much funding, and therefore the government is basically encouraging an official religion. Okay, the government is paying a lot of money to Anglican schools, keeping Anglican schools going, and this means that more and more people will go to Anglican education. They will be educated in an Anglican environment. They'll be taught to be Anglican, and that will basically reverse 100 years of religious non-conformity. So there are concerns in that regard. So the overall headline is there is a basic system. It is not educationally sound for the majority of people. It does not aim for social mobility. Even the reforms are much more focused on technical education, and the secondary education is largely negligible. So therefore there's very little social mobility as a result of education. Finally, in terms of the background, we are going to look at workers' rights. Workers' rights were improving across the 19th century, partly as a result of union action, but essentially, even by 1906, ultimately, if you were a poor person, you had less rights than you perhaps would have today, or even 20 years later. You could be fired for no reason. You could be fined for things. Pay was whatever they decided. There was no controls on working hours. There was no controls on amount of holiday, and that's the role of lockouts is all limited. Okay, so basically, business owners had all the power. Okay, and they were listened to in government, and there were very few protections for workers. Now, the way this was justified was the idea that if the state starts getting involved in running the economy, then that will harm the economy. People know what's best. If a working condition, so logic goes, if the working conditions in a place are so bad, then surely the workers will leave. And that will be acting like individuals, and that will mean the business owners will then suffer, so that will stop them from being too harsh. Okay, that's the logic, although that's not necessarily true, because if there's a limited amount of jobs, you can't really leave. It was also explained that if the government starts doing regulations, minimum wage, minimum amounts of holiday, how many hours someone can work, this will mean that British industry would have to pay its workers more, pay for more workers, and basically it will incur more costs. If the British industry if a factory is having to pay its workers more, or having to pay more because its workers work less hours, then suddenly what will happen is that they will have to charge more money to sell their goods. Like if you are making, I don't know, some cloth, and your workers are now being paid 20% more, you're going to have to make the cloth 20% more expensive, roughly. And therefore, what happens is, when you export, your goods are 20% more expensive, no one's going to buy them, which means that you're not going to export, which means you're going to lose money, which means that the business will go under, and it actually means the working classes might well lose their jobs because the business has failed. So the argument is, with regulation, if you try and control working conditions, that will make the industry less competitive, and therefore mean the industry fails, which means that in the long term, working classes suffer more than they did before, because they don't have jobs now. Okay, while there was a very limited amount of regulations, because the government business owners had all the power, because the government represented the interests of the businesses, and because there was a fear that you don't want to get too involved, because everyone agreed laissez-faire capitalism was good, any breaking of the rules or the regulations was either ignored or weakly enforced. And even then, like if you had working time regulations or child labour regulations, there's only certain industries that would actually account for, and even then you could have lots of exemptions. So while there was little bits here and there was no big protections for the majority of workers. Right, the reforms then. The Liberals have an ultimate problem in regards to the reforms. Their left wing wants a form of collectivism. Their working class voters will want a reformed government which provides a collectivist approach towards welfare, i.e. it is the duty of the state, in order to look after the poor, the dispossessed, and those who are having temporary economic hardship, because those problems are a result of the state or a result of society. People lose jobs not because of their laziness, but because of problems in the economy, and because they are suffering because of an issue they have no control over. They should be helped by the government. On the other side, on their right wing, their middle class supporters, the upper working class supporters who pay for all their taxes, the ratepayers as they were, they emphasise a much more philosophy of individualism and self-help. I.e., most people who are poor or suffering are to some extent or largely there because of their own mistakes, their own fecklessness, their own greed, their own laziness. And therefore, they should be forced to suffer because of that, partly morally, but partly because that's how you encourage people to stop being lazy. If people are lazy and then given stuff for free, that only encourages them to continue being lazy. So when the Liberals do their reforms, in reality, they need to keep both sides happy. They cannot, therefore, go fully individualistic, because that would mean there's no role for the state. But at the same time, they can't go full collectivistic. There has to be a sense of self-help individualism in the reforms. Otherwise, their right-wing and their middle-class supporters will be unhappy. So they have to tread a steady line. And when we look at the reforms, you can see them quite clearly giving a degree of support, but really paying attention to show that they are still basically individualistic, and they still believe in the good and bad poverty, and they still believe in wanting to limit the costs. So we're going to go through one by one each of the reforms. I'm not going to give the specifics. You must research specific examples yourself, and we're going to talk about what we see and why we see it for each. So pensions. The idea here behind pensions is that people must be saved from the excesses of poverty. They must be insulated from the real crippling, miserable, grinding poverty that happens as a result of the excesses of old age and being unable to work. But it also needs to not be nice enough so that people just think, yeah, well, tell you what, I'll just wait until I get my pension and I'll live with my pension, it's fine. People need to be encouraged to still save for their old age, needs to be encouraged to self-help their way out of it, earn enough money so that they don't have to worry about being in old age. Okay, so therefore, while there will be pensions to insulate it, the amounts will be very limited, and what you have to do to get them will encourage you to be thinking about looking after yourself. So Lawyer George thinks he needs to make a radical reform, but it doesn't need to be. If it's too radical, he'll alienate his right wing. And what he realizes is, because there's never been a pension before, if he just introduces a pension, if he just goes, here's a pension, that, even if it's limited, it looks radical. Okay, because there has been no change around this sort of stuff before. So if you are the first person to bring in pensions, you look like you are making a radical change. So even if those pensions are really limited, the fact that you are the first person to make pensions makes it look radical to keep the working classes happy, but those people who actually realise how much it costs, i.e. the middle classes, won't be so angry because actually it wasn't so much. Okay. Additionally, there was a concern that they had to do pensions because it's been in the public ether, it's been in the zeitgeist for a long time, and Chamberlain, as part of the tariff reform, had promised that one of the things they'll do with the money from the tariff taxes is make a pension fund for everyone. Now, at the moment, the Liberals have won the free trade argument. But if they let this idea that if you're poor, we'll give you a pension from tariffs, if they let that argument continue, then it might start convincing poor people that tariffs might be a good thing. But if the free trading Liberals say, we can give you a pension and you don't need it, and we don't need to change tariffs, then that won't work. So they've got to give a pension, because if they don't give a pension, then it will keep the protectionists saying, oh yeah, well, we'll give you a pension as long as we have tariffs. And therefore that might change people's minds. So essentially, you will have a look at the examples, but the pensions are introduced. It's historic. Arguably, it's particularly interesting because it's quite broad-based. Okay, everyone gets it to some extent. There are exceptions, obviously, but if you read between the lines, then the actual pension itself is very limited. Okay, so in reality, people pay towards it. Okay, very low contribution towards the state. Employers pay towards it, and individuals pay towards it. So the government, actually, the pension scheme actually ended up making in the first few years making a little bit more money than they expected. Okay, in part because the state only puts a very little bit of money towards it. This helps keep the taxes down. This helps reduce the limited nature of the state. But as well as that, not many people actually claim pensions because the collection age is much older than the average life expectancy. If you have a pension, but most people die before they're eligible for a pension, you ain't going to have many people collecting a pension. And that's part of the genius of it. There's holy grail that you can have a pension when you reach your old age, but most people are happy with that, but none of them, or most people, will not actually be alive to collect it, or at least in the 1900s. As well as this, the amount of money you got per pension payment was not enough to live on, but it was enough to sort of supplement income. It was enough to sort of make life a little bit more bearable, but it was deliberately kept low so that people would also have to keep saving. They encouraged that idea of you always had to have to self-help your way out, and you couldn't just be dependent on the state. So then that explains why it's quite low. And people who are undeserving poor, those people who were being given other poor law, people who had committed crimes, were deliberately not given pensions. And this is very much they're trying to keep the right wing happy by saying, no, we're not going to give it to the undeserving poor. So the pension system is essentially, on the surface, revolutionary. It's the first lot of pensions that's ever happened. It's very, very key, and it does make a meaningful difference to many old people's lives. But you should not assume it's revolutionary, because actually it does not it's not to live on. People generally don't actually get much money from the state. They have to pay into a lot of it. Employers have to pay into a lot of it, and actually that means that you just get limited wages when you actually you are working, and the state doesn't actually put that much in there. And again, it's limited on who gets it. So in reality, pensions are impressive but not radical. But you can argue, is that a failure if considering J. Lloyd George's aims? Okay, if his aims was to create a truly amazing stellar welfare system, clearly this pension is a failure, because people still struggle. It's not as good as it could be. It's not as kind as it could be. However, David Lloyd George does not intend it to be radical. This is a political action. There's an action to keep the left wing happy but not alienate the right wing. And I would contend that this is quite good. This strikes the balance between keeping the left wing, oh look how amazing, you got a pension, we'll vote for Liberals and we'll keep giving you nice things, on at the same time going, deserving, undeserving poor, limit government spending, people have to still self-help, which keeps the right wing happy. So this is arguably a moral failure if you have a belief that the pensions should be as nice as possible. But we shouldn't judge it too much, considering that the intentions of the government was not to give a 1945-esque social welfare state. Similarly, national insurance is very similar. The political considerations of David and George was not to make a very generous system. It was to make enough increased role of the state, enough collective response to help people who are unemployed, but at the same time not to be too much so that it alienates the right wing. So what we see is a massive increase in the role of the state in terms of the role of doctors who have to help work out who is too ill to work, the role of local councils in making sure unemployment is sorted, and we do see a huge role in the role of the state of taking people's money so that they pay towards their national insurance, etc. But ultimately, it is not significantly generous. The amount of money runs out after a couple of months. The amount of money is not huge, and more importantly, not everyone gets it. Only people in certain industries, the deserving poor. If you are just unemployed, then you don't get the money because you're lazy, you should find a new job. If you are unemployed in one of those industries which the reformers found actually these people are in cyclical industries and therefore they can't massively help their way out of it, then you get the money. So it's again this idea of deserving, people who deserve the money, those in cyclical unemployment who can't find other jobs or can't save up because their wages are so low, they are eligible for it. But the logic is, well, since it's cyclical unemployment, you'll get a job again in 6 months, so it only can last a couple of months, etc. Now again, it was kept deliberately cheap, it was kept deliberately low cost. Everyone has to contribute themselves. Okay, the employees pay towards their own national insurance to encourage this idea of self-help. The state only put a little bit in, so it's not simply you're unemployed, here's some money. It is you have saved towards this, and because you've been a good boy and saved towards this, you can also have some money from us, and only for a little bit. Those people over a certain income, £160, were not eligible. So again, it's this idea of people who have a little bit, who can have the money to save, i.e. if you earn more than £160, you could probably have enough to save for bad times. You're not eligible. And the amount you can get given was very, very low. Okay, in reality, it was designed to work alongside existing banks and friendly societies, which also provided private unemployment insurance. What used to happen before the government's actions was you paid a bit of money towards a friendly society or a building society, and then if you died or if you were ill, then they would pay back towards it. Okay, and again, people who were undeserving, those people who are prisoners, etc., were not given this national insurance. So we see again something which does increase role in the state, does make certain people's lives a little better, but it's not radical. And again, it's deliberately moderate because I'm deliberately trying to keep the cost down and keep the right wing happy. Right, education. So the big thing of education is that very often when we do the question, people forget that education is broader than the other ones. When they ask a question about education, they will almost always ask 1900 to 1918. And people very often only focus on the liberal education reforms, sort of 1907 onwards. But in reality, this also covers the 1902 Act and also the 1918 Act. So when you answer a question about education, make sure you always also consider these acts. So, essentially, what we see across education is an increasing emphasis on making people stay in school longer, increasing the ability of poor students to go to secondary school, which is seen as important to getting the skills and qualifications in order to perhaps get a better job or get a better apprenticeship to work your way up. Now, each act, one on top of each other, aims to strengthen that dynamic. Okay, 1902, for example, wants to encourage more centralisation, more rigour, and more, therefore, oversight of schools. Before, there's lots and lots of different school boards. By replacing it with one or two couple of LEAs, local education authorities, i.e. one per council, you have someone who is far more focused on running things well, who can therefore ensure there is a basic quality. It also encouraged the idea of scholarships, to encourage poor people, to be given free entry, particularly bright poor people, to the secondary schools, which they could not otherwise afford. And that's meant to be an idea of how getting the brightest poor to help hopefully be socially mobile out. Now, as we've already seen, the religious groups did not like the idea of government money going to Anglican schools, but more than that, in reality, despite the fact they quote-unquote encouraged children after 12, the school leaving age at this point, to go to secondary school, in reality there's not much to actually force that to happen. When most children still went off to work to earn their parents' money, they still families still did not have the money or even the inclination to send their children to secondary schools because they didn't see the point or they didn't have the money. So therefore, arguably, when the new Liberals come in, we should see a lot more emphasis on education. If you think about it, education is brilliant for national efficiency because it's the idea of making the young poor. The young are naturally more deserving than middle-aged people because poverty is less their fault, it's more the fault of their parents. As well as that, it does help social mobility. So in 1907, we see a massive emphasis on secondary education. The 25% of secondary schools had to have places for poorer people if they wanted government funding. Now, some secondary schools refused to take government funding because they made enough money from middle class people or upper class people, and they ignored this. But it does mean in certain areas where there were schools which were doing a little bit economically badly and could use that money, they would bring in that 25%. But again, it's very patchy. Certain schools would and certain schools wouldn't. And again, this doesn't do much to actually lead to much more encouraging children then to take those places up. If you're a parent and you genuinely do not believe that education will make a difference to your child's life because A, they'll get apprenticeship, or B, they're not clever enough and they don't have the natural ability, etc., etc., then what happens is you're sending the child to the secondary school and therefore they don't get the opportunity. So what we see, therefore, in 1907 and that sort of stuff is, that is certainly a nice thing, but there's not much more emphasis on the increasing the amount of children who can go to secondary school, and no emphasis on actually improving the quality of the education itself, particularly in elementary school. That costs money. That will rely on people to assume that education is valuable for most people, and actually when most people are needed to work in factories hitting things with hammers, education doesn't necessarily make sense, particularly if you believe that the working classes are kind of genetically born to be workers, and that's why they're working classes. Why the hell would you educate them to be middle class? Because that's, if they were able to do that, then they would be already middle class, if you're taking a social Darwinist perspective. 1918 Act, the one everyone remembers as part of, is Hal Fisher, during the war, pushes the idea of massively increasing the role of the state. Now, this is the most significant reform, but it still has failures. Okay, and part of the reason it's much more socially mobile is you can't send working class people to the Somme and not give them a sense that society will be different. And education is a real nice way to make society different because you're not rewarding lazy, feckless people. You are the hopeful youth, improving their education chance. They are seen as more deserving, therefore you're going to annoy less people by trying to improve it. So they decided what they needed to do is encourage more people and more poor children to actually go to secondary school. And the way you do this is you change the law so that the school leaving age gets risen to 14. You increase the number of places in secondary schools, so you allow private local authorities to run their own secondary schools and create their own secondary schools, so therefore there's places for them, because if you remember that although 25%, if you take government money, secondary schools have to give 25% of their places to poor people. In reality, many secondary schools just didn't take the government money. And also banning children working in some certain professions. And if children are not between the ages of 12 and 14 are not allowed to work in many professions, your parents can't send them to work. And therefore they might be encouraged just to say, oh, tell you what, since they can't work and make money, we'll just send them to secondary school, particularly if it's free. And that's meant to encourage the idea of people taking up secondary education, getting more qualifications, and therefore getting more skills, particularly technical skills, and therefore being more socially mobile. Overall, in terms of educational goals, we're going to talk about health goals in a second. Educational goals, all of these are actually largely a failure. As time goes on, they are arguably more successful. Children who go into secondary school will get a better quality of education, a more academic quality of education. But again, it's only 2 years, and with the absence of qualification and an economic model which is dependent on contacts and apprenticeships, which are dependent on contacts, the educating people has less of a role, really. I.e., people who, if you might be brilliant in secondary school, but that's no help to you if, in order to get a job in a bank, you need to know the right person. So in reality, because the job you got after school was dependent on your connections, schools were seen as a bit of a waste of time because it didn't make much difference. And in reality, there's very little sense behind the majority of the reforms that education is actually going to be a viable way to make society more socially mobile. Okay, and there's therefore less emphasis on improving the quality of education, improving the curriculum, adding more technical education, etc., etc., etc. Okay, and therefore, when you look at the reforms, although there's let's send them to more secondary schools, there's not that much meaningful reform to make education actually much better. Now, you can argue, is this because of political calculation, i.e., because unions don't care about education, because most people are not convinced education is worthwhile because there's other ways of improving it society, and because the world in this era was based around factory work, which you did not massively need qualifications for, or formal education for. You could be trained on the job. Therefore, there's less need to spend lots of money on it. And if you want to improve the quality of teaching resources and education, you have to spend that money. And if you're already worried about not spending too much money to keep your right wing happy, you are going to avoid it where you can. And so because there's less pressure from unions, less pressure from people in order to make changes, you see less change about education. Arguably as well, you can say, is it pointless, is it worth them spending lots of money on education when actually the barriers to students and young people becoming socially mobile, going up or down the classes, are actually more about broader economic problems. Okay, there are much greater barriers around health, barriers around the fact that to get a job you need connections, barriers around the nature of work, the demands of the family, and most importantly, the fact that many working class families don't really want to send their kids to school because they see it a waste of time. So, considering all these barriers, is it actually worth all the time, effort and money to improve education when arguably it won't make that much difference? You might give the best education system ever, but if working class parents don't take it seriously because they don't see it as important, if you might educate these people brilliantly, but they still go to the same factory jobs because they don't know the same people that the middle class people know to get their kids in working in a bank, or getting themselves kids a senior civil service or army position if they're upper class, then it's kind of a waste of time. So education in terms of educational outcomes has very little reform, and this is based around the lack of desire or belief that education will make that much of a difference. Now, when education is a little bit more successful, it's for health reasons. National efficiency wants children to be healthier, so you can even get right-wingers on board to improve health use through schools. So therefore, it's less controversial to actually go to make changes to health. Okay, arguably as well, it is more political to go, let's spend lots of money on education so that these poor people could become middle class people, because that scares middle classes and that's not massively desirable, and that sounds a lot like socialism. Whereas if you say let's improve health so that in a war our country can fight better, everyone can kind of agree with that to some extent. So therefore, when you look at the majority of reforms around young people and health, and education, it's mostly stuff like midwives, school nurses, school meals, and the protection against child cruelty. And so what this is this is about improving the health of children as opposed to the educational outcomes of children. And so when we talk about education, you can argue it's a failure educationally better as a health thing. And you can argue that actually the fact that you have school nurses, you have midwives, you have free school meals paid for by middle class taxpayers for working class kids who otherwise won't get a meal, when you pay for but essentially free healthcare through school nurses, or the state taking children away from people who aren't looking after them, this is a massively increased role of the state, and it's actually quite radical. Like, in theory, laissez-faire economics say you know parents should be trusted to look after their own children, the state should not get involved, but this is the state getting involved in a huge way. And again, you can argue this has a significant impact, but particularly on the working classes. The middle classes and upper classes tend not to have the same healthcare problems or have access to good food and good healthcare anyway, and therefore are not massively helped by school nurses. It makes the biggest difference in the working classes who don't have access to this sort of stuff. So therefore, this is a more successful system, although again, because they're not wanting to spend lots and lots of money, it doesn't make a fundamental change, i.e. infant mortality goes down, but not hugely. Okay, because they're not intending to bring a national health service in, because they're not intending to feed everyone or massively improve the quality of health, they're just trying to make it slightly less bad. There's less emphasis on making a change. So education reforms are there. They are better at health than they are at education stuff because of what their aims are. They do not aim to make as many education reforms as they intend to for health reforms, but ultimately they are still limited. But is that because they failed, or is that because that's what kind of was intended? And I think the latter in that case is true. So looking at the final one then, workers' rights. Now arguably this is one of the more successful ones, similar to unemployment insurance and pensions, because two big things: the unions and the working classes kind of want this to go. And therefore, if you want to keep the unions and left wings happy, like the Liberals really do, you make changes to stuff they want to hear about. They care less about education, so you care less about education. They care more about workers' rights, so you do it. Initially, as the reason we also see as well a lot more change about workers' rights is the people in charge of working rights are initially David Lloyd George, President of the Board of Trade, and then Churchill after 1909. These are very, very dynamic men who get stuff done. And therefore, if you have people who are very good at getting stuff done in charge of workers' rights, you are naturally going to see more stuff actually happen. So you look at the specifics, but essentially, what this does is this reduces the excesses of burdens in terms of hours, holidays, conditions, health risks that working class people have during work. There's a real emphasis on some industries rather than others. For example, the sweated industries, sweatshops, so making lots of low-skilled stuff in very closed environments are really focused on. And so you can argue it's in these industries as a success. However, in other areas and other industries, it's completely ignored. So you cannot say that all workers have rights, because in reality, there's very few, if you look at the evidence, blanket all workers have this rights. It's more specific. Miners get a minimum wage. Sweated workers have hours and limitations. These groups have safety stuff. Whereas other groups, domestic workers and domestic servants, are completely ignored. So in reality, there's only some groups targeted. And again, this is because of political considerations. Most middle class people had a servant. You don't want to annoy most middle class people if you want to keep them on board, so you don't make changes to the rights and responsibilities of servants, domestic service. But the miners are seen as deserving poor because they work a very dangerous job, and the sweated industries are well known in public literature of being really horrible places, so they have the sympathy of the people, so you can make changes. So areas where you can politically make changes and you look good, you make changes. Areas where you don't, you don't. It's also important to realise that some workers, in particular the miners, actually dislike some of the changes, because if you reduce working hours, for example, that means you can make less money. So in reality, there's a rebellion amongst the miners themselves and cuts to working hours, which has to be compromised, which shows that not even the working classes are fully on board. Now you can say this series of things is radical, that because even though it's a hodgepodge of different laws which affect different groups at different times in different ways, you can argue that fundamentally the state is telling business what to do. It is regulating, it is enforcing, it is telling, it is inspecting. And therefore this is a huge rise of the role of the state, and this is therefore a radical reform. Before, the state couldn't go into a business and tell them how much to pay someone, or how to run it, what's safe and what's not. And the fact the state is now doing this shows a radical change. However, the balance on this, in reality, there in many places, even if the laws have been made, there's less government enforcement of actually punishing people who don't do it. Again, certain groups are helped, certain groups are not. There's very little blanket legislation which makes everyone's life better. And in some industries, there's very little changes at all. So, for example, minimum wages only affect certain groups. Other groups, when there is a minimum wage, it's not set on how much workers can live on. It's set on how much the industry can afford. So shipbuilding have minimum wages, but the minimum wages are not enough to live on, because the government says if we set it any higher, then the business will suffer, and that's a problem. So although you've got this workers' right, it's actually still helping the business more than anything else. And really emphasise domestic service. Domestic service is not given minimum wages, is not given workers' protections, is not given anything at all, really. A couple of things here and there, but nothing meaningful. Domestic servants means servants. And this is because a significant base of the middle class support have servants in this period, and if you therefore annoy these people by telling them what they can and cannot do with their servants, you're going to lose their support. So workers' rights is a summary of all the basic stuff we've seen. It's certainly positive, it certainly makes life better, but it did not, and arguably does not, address the fundamental things which keep workers weak. Workers are weak because the business owners do not really care about workers' rights. The workers themselves can be replaced really easily, so they don't have the power to demand, or at this point the unions are not strong enough to demand as part of an organised strike significant changes across the whole industry. And many in the public still don't think workers deserve too much in terms of rights. The mentality is, if it's so bad, leave. When actually that's quite impossible for many people when it's the only job you've got going. So in reality, although workers' rights are there is a lot of continuity and lack of change, with business owners taking the mick, paying poorly, forcing hard work, because most poor people have no other choice. And if you're a business owner and you know the people who work for you have to do what you say, you can pretty much demand what you want. So in reality, although we see legal changes, the government really lacks the political will to force wider change, and also lacks the support of the masses to do that. And in particular, the business owners can continue to afford to ignore most of these reforms, partly because there's no real enforcement or inspection, and partly because they can say to workers, well, you can accept this wage or you can leave, and they know workers will have to accept the wage. So overall, what is the message of the reforms? Okay, this is not the beginning of the welfare state. This is arguably the beginning of the social service state. Now, this is the semantic distinction, but ultimately, this is the argument that this is not full welfare. People are not getting help from the government for doing nothing. People do not have a right to be helped in this system. Throughout this system, there are some people who deserve it, some people who don't. Throughout the system, you have to pay yourself to get it, as opposed to get given it free. So this is not a true collectivist welfare state where people, because they are people, deserve a basic level of income. There is still a sense that some people deserve it, some people don't. If you want it, you have to pay into it. There's still this fundamental individualist self-help, good deserving poor and undeserving poor. But it is a move. Okay? And therefore, although it is not perhaps significantly groundbreaking, particularly if you compare it to Attlee in 1945, it still does make a significant difference, or enough of a difference, to many of the marginal poor. So therefore, actually, you can't say it's bad, it's just limited, because some people's lives in these industries which are helped, so those people who actually get to go to secondary school, those people who are given unemployment insurance for a workplace accident, are genuinely helped. So therefore, when we look at its success, we can say, yes, there is some people helped, tick, but probably it's not huge. But if we look at the aims behind it, David Lloyd George, etc., are not necessarily aiming for a welfare state. The social service state isn't what they're aiming at. Because in reality, they're not trying to make the left wing happy. They're trying to balance the right wing by not going too left wing, but at the same time making the left wing happy by making some change. And arguably all this stuff is left wing enough to make broadly the left wing happy, although they still vote for Labour, but at the same time it's not too extreme that the right wing desert the Liberals in droves. So in reality it's a political success. And we can't say, well, he's a failure because this is all limited, because they've never really intended it to be much more. The aims of this reform was political. It wasn't so much to help people. You can also argue that in the long term, this is a massive success, because it begins the idea that the state should help with welfare. And once everyone accepts the idea that the state should get involved, it's then very easy, step by step by step, to increase the role of the state in welfare. And it's therefore a logical thing. So how about this example? How about this example? A bit more reform, bit more reform, bit more reform. And over time, this is the beginnings and building up of a true welfare state. You cannot have a true welfare state without a first step. And you can argue, therefore, this is the first step, which then other things are built on. And finally, you can say that even the welfare system today, with national insurance, etc., is built upon this idea of contribution. When you earn a salary, or if you already earn a salary, you pay some of that in national insurance. Still, at the cornerstone today, we do not get welfare necessarily for free. You have to contribute towards it, or at least most of it. And therefore, this is a pattern which has existed since and created by the reforms and the Liberal reforms of 1906. So you can argue this is a long-term shift, long-term effect, which has fundamentally made our welfare system, unlike other countries such as Scandinavia, contribution-based as opposed to free at the point of entry, free at the point of everything that you get. Arguably, Attlee does challenge that to some extent. So therefore, although the Liberal reforms are limited, you cannot say they are bad. You can say they are limited and they don't help as much as they could. But always think about what was the intention behind this. And I would say the Liberal reforms, politically, considering it's quite difficult to get that middle ground between keeping the left wing happy and keeping the right wing happy, are actually relatively successful. And then you can also say in the long term, it does have a massive effect on British welfare. All British welfare evolves and therefore basically copies the model of this Liberal reform. And that is vastly, vastly important. The long-term effects of this are more significant than necessarily the short-term. Okay, that's just been under an hour. Apologies for having to listen to me drone on. The big things with this one, remember, they can ask you a whole question about Liberal reforms, or they can focus on one or two Liberal reforms only. You need to make sure you have enough knowledge, enough specific examples, that you can answer an entire 20-mark question on one of these four reforms. So it's very easy to skip this out because it's one lesson, and it's all very similar. You need to make sure you have the specific examples for that. Once again, thank you for listening, and we will next be looking at the constitutional crisis.